Hello, everyone. My name is Ole Kagan, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with LA County Library, and I welcome you to Work Ready, your guide to successful meetings. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Work Ready program. Work Ready started in December of 2020, and it was designed to help people affected by COVID to get a job or improve your work situation. And we're doing that in three ways. The first is we're lending out laptops and Wi-Fi hotspots, so laptops and internet access out of 20 of our library locations. The second way is we're doing events like this one, covering all sorts of work-related topics. And we actually have a YouTube playlist as part of our LA County Library YouTube channel that has a whole bunch of past Work Ready events that we've done covering topics such as resumes, cover letters, interviews, and much, much more. And I'll post a link to that playlist in the chat in just a moment. And the third way that Work Ready is helping folks is by purchasing the latest and greatest career-related books, ebooks, audiobooks, and more. So we have that all available for you at our website, lacountylibrary.org. You can look for books using our catalog link and have them sent to any of our 85 library locations, or you can check out ebooks and audiobooks directly from our website without leaving your chair. And if you'd like to learn more about virtual events with the library, you can also do that by going to our website, lacountylibrary.org, going to the top right-hand corner and clicking on the events, hitting virtual programming, and you'll see all the events that you can access for free via Zoom. And of course, if you click that events, you also get to see all of our other in-person events at our different library locations. All right. And actually, before we get going, I want to let you know that this session is being recorded. So if you need to leave early or you miss any part of it, don't worry, you don't need to take frantic notes. We will share the recording link with you in a follow-up email that will probably go out either a little bit later this week or at the very beginning of next week. And that will also have a copy of this presentation for you so you can review it at your leisure. But now, let's get into your guide to successful meetings. It'll be presented by me, Community Engagement Coordinator Ole Kagan, and our new Administrator for Adult and Digital Services, Stephen Park. And I'm going to bring up the presentation here, and Stephen, you can get us started. All right. All right, Stephen, take it away.
All right, thank you, Oleg. Thank you for letting me be here, and thank you to all those that are attending. As Oleg said, my name is Sajan Stephen Park, and I'm the new Assistant Library Administrator for LA County Library for Adult and Digital Services, and happy to be here. I've had a lot of fun meetings with Oleg. We've been having meetings on meetings, so really excited to share today about Work Ready, your guide to successful meetings. Next slide, please. So let's start about the description of our program. Meetings are ever present in our work lives, but as we all know, they can be frustrating. We wanted to help you today avoid some of those frustrations by sharing some best practices that we've discussed for hosting effective meetings and how to be a stellar meeting participant. And that's something I've been learning in my new role here, meeting with Oleg and the rest of our team as well too. So we're excited to share what we've learned and what we've discussed. So we're hoping by the end of this presentation, you will be able to name at least 3 best practices, hopefully more, but at least 3 for running a productive meeting. We also wanted to share how to effectively plan and lead a meeting if you're in that role to start and create meetings. And when you're in a meeting, we also want to teach you how to be a proactive and engaged meeting participant. And to that end, some topics we'll be covering are, first, we want to define what a meeting is specifically. And then we're going to talk a little bit about meeting with purpose. What does it mean to meet with purpose? For me and Oleg, when we were having our meetings on meetings, our purpose was to create this presentation. So we'll share a little bit about how to meet with purpose. Oleg's going to go a little bit more in depth to the structure and organization of meetings and how that sort of informs how you want to plan and run the meeting. I'll share a bit more about basic meeting etiquette and different types of communication styles that comes up when you're having a meeting with different individuals. And at the end, Oleg will talk a bit more about remote work. We all know the rise of remote and hybrid work in our modern working environment. So Oleg will go into some of the details on some of the unique challenges and the pros and cons and the best practices for remote work as well.
And then, of course, we'll be all set for a Q&A. So if anybody has questions now or anytime during the presentation, feel free to throw them into the Q&A, and so you don't have to keep them in your head, and we'll be able to cover them at the end of the presentation. So Stephen has just talked about our agenda for the day, but what are we talking about? Why even have an agenda? Let's define what we mean when it comes to having a meeting. A meeting for our purposes here is defined as 2 or more people, because if you're by yourself, you're not having a meeting. Gathering at a place and time. Impromptu is also a time, so you can have an impromptu meeting, but oftentimes you have to be somewhere virtually or in person at a given moment with 2 or more people to work towards a specific purpose. Now, Stephen mentioned that the purpose of our meetings was to come up with this presentation. That was a stated purpose. We knew that. Sometimes meetings have unstated purposes, and we'll be talking about why that's not such a great idea in a bit. But this is how we define a meeting. I'm curious, all of the folks in our audience today, I'm sure that you've attended meetings personally, professionally, at church, as part of book clubs. There are many kinds of meetings out there. And I wanted to ask you to post in the chat, when you think of meeting, let's say a work meeting, what comes to mind? What are some questions that you think of? What are some perceptions that are out there about meetings? I'm going to pause for a second to let you type your perceptions about meetings in the chat. So I see team building, that there aren't a time for meetings. People are interested in what's going to be covered, that meetings are unproductive. The meetings are like briefings to get folks up to date about current issues, that they can go too long. We got a few of those. The meetings can run too long, definitely. The meetings can be about brainstorming, absolutely. At meetings, people are just talking. No action is taken. We're going to be covering that. Meetings are a place where decisions are made, ideally. Meetings are all about working together, absolutely. Meeting discussion is a team discussion with a certain goal. That's definitely what the ideal situation. Now, I know that sometimes people have negative perceptions of meetings, and here are some of the types of negative perceptions that one can have about meetings. And a few people have mentioned these in the chat because these are very common when it comes to thinking about meetings that are not very effective. And meetings are always off track. Meetings are an opportunity for self-promotion, that the boss talks way too much. That, of course, extroverts, the people that are not shy at all, the people that talk a lot, those people are going to take over in a meeting, poorly planned. We've got some people in the chat saying that meetings is to address inquiries that may apply to all team members. Yes, that's an important point, that you want to get the people that are relevant to be at that meeting. I like that a lot of people mentioned that meetings are for making decisions. A lot of people also posted positive things about meetings. And, when we get too much into these negative elements of meetings, we think, well, why have meetings at all? Well, and the reason is that almost every human endeavor, any undertaking that's worth anything, has come through collaboration. And what is collaboration but having meetings? Here we have an image of the Hoover Dam, a amazing engineering marvel that surely took meeting after meeting after meeting to make decisions about how it was going to come together. But the Hoover Dam is a big undertaking. Not even the smaller achievements, like putting together a presentation on meetings, requires you to have meetings. And so I appreciate everybody sharing their points of view with us. But of course, meetings are so important. That's why we're here, to give you a sense of how to have effective meetings. So Stephen is going to talk to us about what's a few people mentioned, that meetings need to have a purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Oleg. Yeah, whether it's building the Hoover Dam or, like Oleg said, presenting to you all folks here, every meeting should have a purpose. But there are many different types of meetings and genres of meetings, and depending on the different types of meetings, that leads into different purposes. In the chat, some of you have shared some of those different types of meetings. For example, when you're trying to brainstorm, you're sharing ideas and having a dialogue. So you're trying to come up with as many ideas as possible. Examples of this can be, let's say you're coming up with a food menu for a restaurant, or you're coming up with a mission statement for your working group. Maybe you're doing a post-mortem after a project. Here, we really want to encourage people to share and have the freedom to express all their thoughts in a safe, open place for ideas sharing and dialogue. Other meetings are all about decision making. You have all the ideas, you want to discuss the pros and cons of each option, and then all collaboratively come up with a specific decision. Examples can be, maybe you're trying to decide a final build site for a construction project. On a budget team, you have a certain amount of money and you need to decide which project to fund, which projects not to fund. For many of us, if we're part of hiring a person after the interviews, you need to come together to have a meeting about which person to hire. All of these are meetings that have very specific purposes. Other meetings, this is possibly an example of one, are for information sharing or teaching. It's usually one or more people presenting in a forum. This could be, in a town hall. It could be in a Zoom meeting like this. It could be, a PTA meeting. These are to share the information to the audience as clearly as possible. And at the end, there might be a Q&A with some dialogue, but primarily the purpose of the meeting is to share information. In a working environment, there's also check-ins, and purpose of a check-in could be any one of these above meeting types, but it's also to sort of track progress, maybe deal with obstacles that just came up, maybe to clarify some issues. And all of these meetings have specific purposes, and that's what we really want in a meeting. Otherwise, we're just sort of hanging out or having a chat. And those are great too. I love hanging out with Oleg, getting some lunch. But in a work environment, in a professional environment, in an academic environment, when you have a meeting, you really want to meet with a purpose.
So what's a
And
risk of having a meeting without a purpose?
I think, Oleg, when you don't have a purpose, people are often confused as why they're there. They might not know what their role is in a meeting, what they're there for. They might not know why they spent the afternoon, in a meeting. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of purpose. And I think that's why when you have a meeting, you want to be clear with, what the purpose is.
Yeah, things can definitely go off the rails a little bit if you don't have a track
We
for
have a
the
question
meeting.
in the chat. Can you share some generic purposes? Um, Again, depending on the type of meeting, the purposes can vary, but I would say one generic purpose for a meeting is you want to come away from the meeting with some action, some next steps. You want to be at a place after the meeting that you weren't before the meeting. And that could mean a lot of different things, but you want the meeting to push forward some progress in whatever you're working on or whatever you're
Mm.
meeting to discuss.
And we're going to have, so one of the things that we're going to be talking about in a little bit is that each topic in a meeting should have its own outcome. So sort of a mini purpose towards a bigger purpose. Um, a bigger purpose is often aligned with some kind of strategic organizational mission. So you might have several projects running at the same time, and you meet to make decisions about each of these projects and how they interact. Or a meeting could be about one project, and you need to get something done within that project. So, for instance, review a document. So let's talk about some nitty-gritty when it comes to meetings, some structure and organization of meetings. So meetings, to be effective, are really about one thing. Well, let's say two things. The thing is to get something done, but how do you do that effectively? It's all about respect. And one of the ways that you can be respectful to the task and the people involved is through some structure and organization. One strategy in that regard is to assign meeting roles. Every meeting typically has a facilitator, a chair, a leader, the person who's calling the meeting, the person who's running the meeting. That role is crucial because that person is ultimately responsible for making sure the meeting keeps running, making sure that the goals for each topic are achieved, making sure that everybody in the meeting is respectful to everybody else. And really, that person is the one who's sort of planning how the meeting is going to run and how we're going to get to the ultimately successful end result. That person also happens to be the one to put together the agenda. They don't have to do it on their own, but they're going to be the ones who puts it together and sends it out. And we'll talk more about agendas later. Very important topic. A second role is timekeeper. So this is something that's oft forgotten when it comes to meetings, but really, really a useful person to have. A timekeeper might pause and let everybody know that, we're through half the allotted time of the meeting, or that, we're 5 minutes to the end. So at that point, the facilitator will have to help the group triage. What's the most important thing that we need to accomplish in the next 5 minutes? Or are we able to go a little bit over time? The timekeeper might also work with the facilitator to identify how much time each agenda item should take, and then let the group know that when you're nearing the end of that agenda item. So, whatever that purpose of that item is, it needs to be achieved within this time period. And the timekeeper's purpose is to do that. Timekeeper is a good role for somebody who's comfortable interrupting the meeting proceedings, or somebody who is very shy and needs to work on being able to jump in and say, oh, time. Another important meeting role is the note or a minute taker. Usually people in meetings will take their own notes, but those notes can be of varying quality because sometimes those people are really involved in talking during the meeting. So if you're talking during the meeting, it's very difficult to interact in depth and also be taking in-depth notes. So having an assigned meeting taker means that somebody will have prepared to take notes, rather either if it's a remote meeting, to have their proper notepad or whatever document open so that they can take the notes, or in an in-person meeting, have the structure of their notes all set up so that when people start talking, they can really record what has happened at that meeting, and that will serve then later as a record of what happened at the meeting. Now, there's certain types of meetings, some that are, for instance, covered by the Brown Act, where there needs to be minutes taken at the meeting, and those minutes need to be officially approved at the next meeting. But even informally, that's a good opportunity for everybody to be on the same page. The note taker will take the minutes, then send them out after the meeting to everybody. Everybody can edit the notes as they need to, and then we'll all be on the same page on what for instance, the action items are. And the project owner is the final role I'll be talking about, and that really is the stakeholders involved in the various topics that are going to be covered during the meeting. So if we're talking about a certain project, a certain product, etc., there have to be the people who are taking the lead on those items or taking the lead on the tasks that need to be involved. Those people need to be ready to participate in the meeting. Those people also have an important meeting role, and that is to be ready to share what they need to share when they're called on. These roles should be known in advance. That way, everybody can be prepared to do what they need to do so that when everybody's finally in the same space, nobody's scrambling to get ready or to find the information that's needed. Everybody can strictly focus on the goal of the meeting. And finally, somebody mentioned this in the chat earlier. It's really important. Not everybody needs to be at every meeting, even when it's a meeting with a lot of people in a department. Sometimes not everybody's part of a certain project and not everybody has something relevant to share, whether in knowledge or skill at that meeting. And I don't know about you, but most people don't feel bad when the meeting facilitator or chair or the leader talks to them and says, hey, you could be at this meeting if you want to be, but really, you don't have to be. Like, okay, I'll go do my work, no problem. And they can always, of course, look at the meeting minutes and add information in the meeting minutes, so they can be called into the meeting if they really, really end up needing to be there. But it's good for the facilitator to really consider in advance whether everybody who's anybody needs to be at the meeting. So those are meeting roles. Let's now talk about time management, a vital part of effective meetings. And the first element of that is to have a definite start and end time. Now, most meetings have a definite start time. In remote meetings, sometimes you give 5 minutes or so for people to get their technology all set up and get in and get settled. There's usually a 5-minute grace period before you start the meeting. In-person meetings, the idea is that you start on time, because everybody knows they should be arriving a little bit early. They should have all this set up and be ready when the meeting starts. And that's just like, we're going to be echoing this. That's just a matter of respect to start the meeting on time so that the people who are there are rewarded by getting their work done and ending the meeting on time. Everybody knows about starting meeting, but not everybody, when running meetings, designates a specific end time. And that's really important. The reason is because the facility should be thinking ahead. What can we cover during this hour? Nobody minds if a meeting or speech program ends a little bit early, but everybody's upset when a meeting time cuts into their lunch or forces them to stay later at work or forces them to shift their whole day schedule because somebody didn't think ahead and plan how long things were going to take, and there was no timekeeper and everybody just lost track of time. Meetings need to have a designated end time. And when you're thinking ahead for a meeting, if your meeting is for some reason, and it should be pretty rare, a meeting should be more than 2 hours or longer. If a meeting is 2 hours, there should definitely be a break involved. If a meeting is 4 hours, there should probably be maybe 2 breaks. And that just gives people time to get up, stretch their legs, check their messages, answer return phone calls, just stare into space and let their brain rest a little bit. Because going straight for 2 hours, that's very difficult. Most people can't focus for that long. Now we're talking about an action plan or action items, and that's part of the next element of having an effective meeting. That's to have an agenda. This is another one of the things, just like end times, that frequently falls by the wayside in meeting culture in many organizations. And yet it is probably, I don't know if you agree, Stephen, but this is probably, in my opinion, the most important element of having an effective meeting. And it really is about demonstrating respect for the people who are at the meeting. So I would say that 90% of meetings, if not more, should have an agenda. What kind of meetings don't need an agenda? Well, if you have a standing meeting with the same person, it's just the two of you, and you guys are always talking about the same thing, or if it's like Stephen and I who are meeting about this presentation, we don't need an agenda. It's just the two of us. We know exactly what we're meeting about. There aren't too many steps involved. So we don't have to have a set agenda. The agenda is literally what the only thing we're doing at the meeting. Other meetings that don't really need an agenda are very quick stand-up meetings that just are all about everybody checking in. So in the Agile methodology, scrums don't really need an agenda because they always have the same agenda. Everybody checks in, you try to, if anybody has a problem, you try to solve that problem. Or I used to have a meeting when I was at the West Hollywood Library. We would have a stand-up meeting at the beginning of every day, and there was a definite end time because this was before the library opened. We had to open the library at a certain time, so everybody had to go and get ready to open the library. So we couldn't be there that long, but it was really, really useful to have that stand-up meeting because we all got on the same page. What was happening today? What was everybody up to? And done. That kind of meeting doesn't really need an agenda. Every other meeting absolutely does. And the reason is, one, to help you prepare. Two, to keep the meeting on track during the meeting. And three, to help the note taker keep track of what's going on at the end. So having an agenda, this is something that the meeting facilitator should be coming up with and sharing in advance of a meeting, ideally in soon, with as much time as possible before the meeting so that people can prepare. In thinking ahead to an agenda, the facilitator limits the number of topics that can be covered within the allotted time period for the meeting. And you have to be realistic about that. If you know that something is going to take a ton of discussion, then you probably can't include a lot of other things during the meeting. If you only have an hour and something's going to take 45 minutes, you anticipate that it'll take 45 minutes to get that outcome for that agenda item, then you're probably only going to have one or two things on that agenda. And that's fine. You can have one or two things on an agenda and then have another meeting for something else to cover or extend the time of the meeting. Meeting agendas help you focus on what really needs to be achieved. Certain things can be sent out by email, and that brings me to that each agenda item should have an outcome. We talked about what are some generic purposes. These outcomes are some generic purposes for an agenda item. So an example of that would be aware. So that's like an information you're just sharing. But if that is literally just me telling you something, then that frequently could just be sent as a memo or as an email. It doesn't really require taking time for everybody to be in the same place at the same time to receive that information. However, when there are anticipated questions or some discussion is necessary about this information, where it would benefit for everybody to be there and share their feelings about it at the same time, then be aware is a really good outcome to have at a meeting. Another outcome would be a decision. So here's the question that we have. Should we enable this feature in the software that we're developing? And then all of the people who are the stakeholders discuss that. And by the end of this discussion, we need to have a yay or nay, whether we should or we shouldn't. And that's the win condition in the meeting. The meeting is successful if by the end of that item, we can decide yes or no, we're moving forward. And if it's a yes, then the next outcome, perhaps at a different meeting, is then to do or assign. So another type of meeting outcome is do assign. To do is the people at the meeting are going to have to do something. So you're going to have action items for each person based on whatever you discussed. Or assign, if you have staff, you're going to have to assign these action items to other people. And the win condition there is at the end of this topic, we're going to have this list of action items to then move forward, perhaps. And sometimes an action item is to set up another meeting with a different group of people to get a little bit more in depth on something. So having this is really important. I have a personal example, and then we're going to move forward with meeting etiquette and communication. But this is related to an agenda. I was part of a group that was trying to achieve something. It was not a professional group. It was outside of work. And we were trying to put together a community. And the person leading it, Greg, it's not his real name. That's what I'm going to call him. He refused to create agenda, says it killed creativity. I said, no, we need agendas. In my mind, I was screaming, but we had meetings every Friday and never had agendas. The meetings were freewheeling. In some ways, I like that. In some ways, it wasn't effective. And one day, it really came to a head how ineffective not having an agenda for those meetings was. So we were going through the meeting, and then Greg brings up this document. It was a virtual meeting, brings it up on the screen and said, hey, what do you guys think about this? He had sent it out earlier that week. And I said, Greg, look, I'd love to be able to share what I think about that document, but I didn't know we were going to be talking about it today. So I didn't prioritize reading it. So I didn't read it. If you want me to share my feeling about this document, this 3-page document that I can scan in 20 seconds, I feel like that's not going to be that useful. It would have been nice if I would have known that we were going to be talking about it. Then I could have prioritized doing this rather than 3 other things that I did that we're not actually talking about at this meeting. Well, we never came to an agreement about agenda. He still feels like agendas kill creativity. I think that agendas help facilitate creativity because then everybody who's part of the meeting can prepare their creative ideas, their creative thoughts. And that brings us to our next topic.
Thank you, Oleg.
Etiquette.
You mentioned, respect and consideration, and I think that's really at the heart of meeting etiquette and communication, in all environments, not just a professional environment. If you want to be an effective meeting participant, these are some basic meeting etiquette tips that we have for you. First off, be prepared. Just like when we were in school, you want to do your homework and be prepared when you're coming into a meeting situation. You want to review the agenda that the meeting facilitator has provided and make sure you understand what is this meeting, what is the purpose of this meeting, and be prepared for your part in that meeting. So often in a meeting, whether your role is as a notes taker or a timekeeper, you might have an area when you're asked to speak, to give your feedback or to share some data or your observations, and you want to be prepared. The meeting isn't the place for you to be researching what you're going to say. You don't want to be, fumbling on your phone or do your files when sort of the spotlight comes on you for you to speak. You want to have your speaking parts kind of ready and share that with the team as soon as possible. Another part of it is sort of know your role, right? Oleg mentioned the different roles in a meeting, but also in a meeting, sometimes you're a stakeholder who's invested in the outcome of the meeting. Sometimes your role is bigger. Sometimes it's your role to make the decision or be part of driving this decision. Sometimes you're sort of more of a participant, just getting the information to share with maybe your other teammates or a different department. So sort of understanding your role in that meeting and what your purpose is in that meeting really goes a long way in being prepared for that meeting. And like Oleg was mentioning, and we were talking about earlier, understanding the goal and ultimate purpose of the meeting, that really needs to be on your mind when you're contributing. So a meeting isn't the place for you to be sort of going on tangents, bringing up different topics that's not really relevant to what the meeting is for. Definitely a meeting is not a place for you to sort of hash out your personal conflicts with another team member, or especially criticize somebody, in public. There's that line, right? You want to praise in public, but when you do have critical feedback, you want to do that in private and, a closed arena where you can be respectful to the other party you're speaking to. Um, and, you know, again, like Oleg said, it's all about respect, right? You want to let people finish what they're saying. You want to be respectful and engaged, and you want to understand, what your part is in that meeting. And if you're leading a meeting, for the next slide, Oleg, meeting etiquette is even more important. If you're leading a meeting or you're part of the leadership of a meeting, you really need to be more aware of the fact that we're all different, right? And we all come from different backgrounds, different cultures, even different language, um, upbringings. Sometimes English might not be your first language. And we need to know that different people have different communication styles. We have different ways of learning. We all have different ways of sharing information, and we all have different styles in sharing information in a meeting. So as a meeting leader, you want to be mindful of, who are the folks that are the talkers, the extroverts, the people that are comfortable with sharing. And be mindful of the people that are a bit more shy, or the people that need a few more minutes to be more thoughtful with their statements. Some people might have a lot of ideas, but they sort of keep it to themselves until the end of the meeting or after the meeting. And we've all sort of been there when after the meeting you're like, oh, I should have said this, I should have said that. So as a successful meeting facilitator, you want to give everyone sort of the space and the grace and the time to share, their part in a meeting. Similarly, as a group facilitator, you need to be sort of astute and aware of the group dynamics. Understand that we're all coming to this meeting with our own um, experiences, but we also have our own motivations. Sometimes in a meeting, two or more parties are competing for resources. Sometimes we're trying to advocate for our point of view, possibly versus a different point of view, and that's all positive. Meetings are the place to have those productive conflicts where you come up with the best results, but you want to be mindful of the different dynamics going into the meeting, so you don't create that space where people are using it as an arena, to attack people or to hash out past grievances, and just to sort of keep everyone on track as to the purpose of the meeting. And definitely as a meeting facilitator, you want to be engaged. You want to be focused and be present in the meeting, especially if you're leading it or if you have, a role facilitating that meeting. But as a participant, you definitely want to also be engaged. We're all busy. We're always multitasking. But in a meeting, especially a meeting with purpose, you want to give everyone the respect and consideration and focus when someone's speaking. Let them finish. And when you're speaking, be mindful of your own time as well too, and make sure not to dominate the whole conversation or dominate the meeting. Um, and it really comes down to, the golden rule, right? I was talking with Oleg about this. We all learned treat others how you want to be treated. And, I know how my style is and the way that makes me comfortable in a meeting. But Oleg had a great addition to that role. It's treat others how they want to be treated. Um, Maybe somebody doesn't learn the way you do. Maybe somebody doesn't feel comfortable the way you feel comfortable in a meeting. Maybe they're new to the group or the team. And all those things kind of goes into being aware of how others communicate, where they're coming from, and really treating them how they want to be treated in a meeting. And as a facilitator, you want to make sure that others also treat others in a similar way, and sort of try to put curbs on it when you see the behavior sort of going off track or not being as respectful or not being as considerate of others. And Oleg, part of modern workforce, I think all of these things get really intensified when you're working from home or when you're on a Zoom call like this, right, Oleg?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we felt like we had to include a section on remote or hybrid meetings. Over the last 2, 3 years, I don't even know anymore. Uh, Many of us have, for the first time, or have just more frequently been involved in meetings where everybody is somewhere else. And that's a specific type of meeting with some of its own rules and its own important aspects. And I thought we would be remiss if we didn't cover that. But before I do that, this is going to be the last section of the presentation. So if you have questions, do put them in the Q&A. We're going to be happy to stick around and have a little bit of a discussion with you about your meetings and any thoughts or questions you had about what we've been presenting. So remote and hybrid meetings have a variety of pros and cons, and I'm not going to cover all of them, but one of them that I felt was important to start with is that being able to meet remotely is really an important privilege. And it's a privilege both that in the sense that it saves you time. You don't have to drive. People can come from different places. For instance, in a meeting like this, we can have somebody from Wisconsin. We can have somebody from across the world. We can have somebody from Australia. It's like nighttime in Australia now. Zooming in, and we have had people from all over the world. And that's really a privilege, but it's also a privilege because not everybody can participate in remote meetings for a variety of reasons. Being part of a remote or hybrid meeting requires a computer that's powerful enough, an internet connection that's fast enough, and most importantly, a private space where you can be part of the meeting and not be interrupted and not have kids or other people walking around disturbing you and the other meeting participants. I know in the place that I used to live, it was very difficult for me and having 2 kids to be able to have remote meetings. And live in a different place now, and I'm able to have remote meetings because I have a little office space, and not everybody has that. So we must recognize that that is something that is a privilege for people. Another con of remote meetings is that there are less signals. We don't always see people's body language as much as we do when we're in a room. In a room, you can look around, you can see how everybody's feeling at a glance. You can hear certain sounds. You can see people's facial expressions, body posture, where are they looking? All of that is clear when you're in person. Remotely, you don't necessarily get to see that. You can see sometimes when people have their video on, you can hear their voice, but that's just one person. Even if you have everybody on the screen at the same time, it's pretty hard to see all these faces um, necessarily at a glance. So that's something that one has to get used to and be prepared for when moving to remote meetings. Now, I mentioned here flexible collaborative possibilities is a pro of hybrid or remote meetings, and that's true. There's I should say, different collaborative ways when it comes to remote or hybrid meetings and in-person meetings. In-person, as we all know, you're in a room, you can have a whiteboard, you can have another, a flip chart somewhere else, you can have post-its in a different part of the room. Everybody can go to different parts of the room and participate in a variety of ways. In a online environment, we can certainly all look at the same whiteboard. We can share a document that we can all see, but there just isn't that same amount of space. And what I think we lose in space online, we get in a sort of collaborative practice. So it's really hard to all have a pen and be editing the same document in person. That's kind of a silly mental image of everybody sitting at a table, like reaching out and with their pen and trying to change a document. But it's pretty easy to do online. And I find that's very useful. I mean, Stephen and I, for instance, could edit this PowerPoint at literally the same time. We did. Stephen was working on one slide, I was working on a different slide, and it was very easy to do. In an in-person meeting, or as I should say, in a remote meeting, uh, You have access to research documents, and you can, everybody's on a computer, so you can really look things up faster. You can, if something comes up, you can quickly bring up a graph or a chart to share or get a fact. And then the last pro that I want to talk about is that meetings online are much easier to record than meetings in person. And meetings in person can be recorded too. I mean, look, put a tape recorder out, put a video camera on the meeting, but accessing that later is where it starts to get tricky. People have to have a video, find that physical video, and put it. I'm like almost like put it into your VCR and watch it. Um,
It really
uh,
helps when you're a note taker too. If a meeting is recorded, you can always go
right.
back and catch details you missed.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, if you're a note taker. But if even if you wanted to be part of the meeting, you had to miss part of it, just like this presentation. You could easily go and watch it again, rewind, fast forward, watch it faster. Much easier than an in-person meeting. Now, these are some pros and cons of remote and hybrid meetings. Another aspect of remote meetings that many people who haven't had as much chance to participate in remote meetings are sort of hit by and have a hard time adjusting to is the multi-channel communication nature of remote meetings. So in an in-person meeting, of course, there's multi-channel. People are you have to see things. Sometimes you have visual aids. People are speaking, sure, but they're all pretty much in the same kind of visual sense space. When you're having a remote meeting, it feels, at least when you start, like you have like 2 or 3 places you have to look at the same time. So for instance, you've got the video going on. So you might have a visual aid, like a chart on the video. You might have a person speaking. So these are 2 things to focus on already right away. And then on this over on the side in this area here, you have the chat going. And at meetings where there's multiple people, and particularly people of multiple generations, you'll find that the younger people are all going crazy in the chat. And while at the same time somebody's speaking. And in those kind of situations, the items there in the chat are sometimes of equal importance to the person speaking. And I've been part of online communication for a really long time. So for me, I have no trouble listening to the person speaking, looking at the visual aid, and also following the chat and participating in the chat. But that is something that one has to get used to, because that's a very normal thing for the chat to be going as well as the sort of the traditional part of the presentation. And the good thing is that getting used to this multi-channel communication format is really a lot like learning to drive. Initially, you get on and you start the car, you have maybe a teacher next to you, and the teacher says, "Oh, make a left turn." And you think, "Oh no, I have to show my turn signal and turn the wheel slightly and try to get into between these lanes and pull up. Wait, I see the light. Now, do I pull up a little bit here? Do I pull up a little bit more?" You're thinking of 20 different things, 20 different ideas, steps, concepts. You're looking all around. Everything is just overloaded. And think about how probably you drive now. Maybe you're not a student driver anymore. 6 months later, a year later, like making a left turn, you don't even think about it. You're listening to an audiobook, or you're talking to a friend, and you're driving without having to consider any of those things. That's just like what multi-channel communication ends up being like. After a while, it's just what's happening to you. You don't even think about it. And the final aspect of remote meetings I wanted to cover is just a few best practices and things to think about when it comes to remote meetings. So the first is to be clear as a meeting facilitator about your camera preferences. And by camera preferences, I mean, do you want people to be on camera? You want people to be off camera? You don't care. You want only the speaker to be on camera. Something that happens when the facilitator is not clear about this is like half the people on the meeting are on camera, and most of them are just sitting there looking. You can usually see them looking at other things on their screen. Some people are just staring at the camera. Some people are kind of like this because their camera's angled weird. One person is speaking, and then everybody else has their cameras off. And that's being kind of a mishmash, because anytime any of those other people on camera make a noise, then they come on camera and you see there's somebody talking, but you see a flash of one person just staring like this. So it's good for the facilitator to let the people in the meeting know, like, especially if you're the boss, if you have that authority. Sometimes you don't have that authority, but if you're the boss, let people know, I prefer if everybody had their camera on during the meeting. Then, it shows that you're engaged. You can see everybody's reactions and everything, or not. Like personally, it doesn't matter to me. I don't care if people have their cameras on or off. Um, since when I'm running the meeting, I'll be looking at all the different elements. And if I want people's point of view, then I'll just ask for it, or I'll ask for other ways to share. So this is one of the pros of online meetings that I didn't really talk about before, and that is that it's easier for introverts. Those people that have trouble interrupting, those people that should practice doing it by being a timekeeper, those people that have trouble interrupting, when there's freewheeling conversation going on, you just can't get in. With online meetings, there's a lot of features that make doing that a lot easier. So for instance, there are emojis that you can post that shows your reaction to something right away, a smiley face or confetti or I don't know, a sad face. You can post in the chat where you don't have to, it's much easier to jump in the chat than it is if you have to interrupt people and if you self-conscious about interrupting people. I mean, you can also have polls in meetings. That's an easy way to gauge people's point of view. So those are important things for a facilitator to note. It's like what Stephen was talking about, communication styles, for those people who are a little bit shy, sometimes you have to ask them deliberately, Joe, what do you think? Or, I know that so and so are going to have trouble uh, sharing their point of view, or so and so, or this other person is going to be overwhelming. So if you have a poll, it makes things a lot easier. If you want to, queer people in the chat, it makes things a lot easier. But when we talk about things like polls and those other kind of features, we're talking about the different technological elements of being in a remote meeting. And you want to be able to test those things in advance. So the basic things that you're testing, of course, is your sound, your video, to make sure the angle of your video is normal and not, not everybody's not just looking up your nose, that people can hear you through your microphone, that there isn't a lot of background noise, that if you want to share a screen, that you know how to do it, and the software that you're sharing works well with Zoom. The best way to test those kind of things out is to do it in advance. Many video conferencing platforms allow you to have a private room where you can just go in by yourself and just test those things. But really the best way to do it is with another person. So you establish just a meeting, one-on-one meeting, and then you do the things that you want to do, and you can ask that person right away. Are you able to hear me? Are you able to see me? What do you see on the screen now? Is it the same thing that I'm seeing? And get that feedback, and it makes those adjustments right away. For instance, polls, you can say, did you see the poll come up? And then you can see when they input information, you can see it how it looks on your end. And it's really good to do that in advance rather than in a meeting with 15 people where you're scurrying to figure out how to run a poll, and the timekeeper is going, we need to get done with this item. We need that decision made. Now, we talked earlier about arriving on time or early, and I said that, sometimes remote meetings, you have a little 5-minute leeway at the beginning of the meeting for everybody to come in. But one thing that people often miss in remote work environments, where, of course, hybrid remote meetings flurry or, proliferate, where there's so many of them, is that water cooler time, where you can just have, just small talk with people, get to know what your colleagues did over the weekend or what sports teams they like. And a great time to do that is before the start time of a remote meeting. So oftentimes people will get in there like, 10 minutes before, 5 minutes before, and often it'll be like just a few people who get there early. And those are people who are then gonna just chat, hey, Geraldine, how's it going? How's your grandma? Let's share some pictures of the kids. And you have that little nice time that's unstructured that you can just have a human conversation with people. And it just makes the rest of the meeting then, once you get into the actual working part of the meeting, a little nicer. Some facilitators like to start meetings with icebreakers, ask everybody a question, what's your favorite movie? Or, do you prefer rain or sun? The very pertinent question for Angelinos these days. And then people can post in the chat or can speak, what they prefer. And sometimes it's good to have a meeting agenda item, just the icebreaker, give it 5 minutes so that everybody can ease into meeting mode and get to know the team. And then finally, similar to technology, you want to have your visual aids ready. Stephen mentioned that as a meeting participant, you don't want to be doing your research in the moment. You don't want to be the one who's in a flurry trying to bring up your presentation. You want to have all that stuff already open so that when it's time to share it, you can just hit share, select the window, and there it is, and you're off to the races. And we are very close to the finish line here. That's all I had about remote and hybrid meetings. If anybody has questions, do post them in the Q&A. I see a few people have already posted, and we're getting to the end. So Stephen is going to take us out by talking about some library resources that we have that are potentially going to be useful for you.
Thank you, Oleg. Like you're saying, it's a lot. There's definitely so much about meetings that we can't just cover in a 1 hour meeting on meetings. But luckily, there's tons of resources out there. We reviewed many of these to prepare for this meeting. Of course, starting with books and ebooks, you could always go to our catalog and check out physical books or online books on meetings. There's an example of some popular ones on the right. With our online learning courses and resources, there's tons of additional videos, even whole training courses on how to successfully run meetings. Some examples are, LinkedIn Learning, Gale courses, Learning Express, BrainFuse, Job Now. And these are really business professionals that are dedicated to helping you succeed in your professional and, personal life with how to run better meetings. So there's tons more content there that you can follow. And we always have additional virtual and in-person programming. Oleg has, as he mentioned earlier, the Great Work Ready program. So we'll be continuing with these programs to provide you support, not only on how to, be successful in meetings, but just be successful in a professional workplace. And if you want to learn more, you can go to our website, lacountylibrary.org/learn. And you can also just, reach out on the next slide. If you want, if you have more questions, you can always speak to a real librarian. We're available on the phone Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 6. You can text us, you can email us. We even have an instant librarian chat feature where you can text us a question, and we're standing on by to a real person, a real librarian, to answer any questions you have. And of course, for more information, go to our website, lacountylibrary.org/contact us.
And those questions, they can be about meetings or anything else. Our folks will help you do research on a great variety of topics. So don't hesitate. If you have a question, give us a call, text us, go into your browser and chat with our librarians. We're happy to help. Speaking of happy to help, it's question time. So we had a few questions, and if you do have the questions, put them in the Q&A right now, or you can put them in the chat, but those are a little bit harder to follow in the chat. So the Q&A is the best place for questions. Any questions related to meetings, what we've talked about, any best practices that you'd like us to review or cover, or any situations that you might have had, as long as it's not too specific, we'll be happy to take care of those for you as well. So let's get on to some of the questions. Would LA County Library offer Zoom membership meeting to library patrons? That's a great question. I think the question here is, would we offer Zoom accounts to people? And while that would be a really nice thing for us to do, I'm afraid that that's an expensive proposition. So I don't think that we can do that. Zoom does offer a free version. So it doesn't give you access to everything Zoom, and there's limitations to the free version of Zoom, but you can definitely make use of that if you want to have virtual meetings. Similarly, there are programs like Google Meet that's also totally free with some limitations, but I've used it outside of work, and it works pretty well. have a lot of interesting and interesting backgrounds and on Google Meet. So here's a situational question. And I'll throw this out to Stephen first. There's an individual at a meeting that visibly or verbally explodes when unhappy with topics, makes everyone
Yeah.
uncomfortable. What do you do in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think that goes back to, consideration and respect. If it's one person doing this in a meeting, and it's, a pattern and it's frequent, that's something you definitely want to address. Probably in the meeting is not the place to do that. Usually that meeting will end, and at that point, if you have that trust or working relationship with this person, you want to really be honest and give them that feedback. Like, hey, when you do that, I know you're upset. I get that you don't like these topics, but when you do that, it makes other people uncomfortable. It shuts down the conversation, and it doesn't ultimately lead to the outcome that he wants, or he or she or they want, which is, um, that particular topic to go the way that they want it to go, or to be addressed in a different way. So I think again it comes to, because we're all learning, and that person also needs to learn how to change his behavior and his reactions, improve it in a meeting so it's productive for everyone. But yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, not as much of a meeting question as more of a supervision question where the supervisor really has to address that topic. If it happens during a meeting, that's and I've had that happen at I ran a writing group, and there was very occasionally people who were disruptive at the writing group, and other kind of meetings where people try to derail the conversation, don't want to talk about a topic, or not prepared. All of those things can be treated on a scale of kind of severity, where if somebody's being, for instance, at a writing group, somebody's being rude or giving feedback that's too mean or not helpful, I've actually had to take people out of the room and have a conversation with them, where everybody's, continuing the meeting, and I, as a facilitator, would step outside and go, look, this is not the way we do things here. And if you'd like to come back, then you're going to have to be, X, Y, and Z. You're going to have to be more respectful. So that's one thing. Even if you want to take care of something quickly, then that's one thing. Where it's a voluntary situation. That person can participate if they follow the group's rules. Of course, at work, it's a different kind of standard where you people tend to have to be civil with each other, or at least if they want to get work done. So yeah, in that sense, everything that Steven said was right on target. We had a comment here. One Zoom meeting purpose would be to have book clubs remotely. 100%. My wife has a book club that she is part of remotely with people from all over California. I'm curious to hear your feedback on this. When should the agenda be sent out, Stephen?
Yeah, ideally as soon as possible, but we all know that's not really possible all the time. But for me, I definitely want the agenda to be provided to me, at the very minimum, half an hour to an hour before the meeting starts.
That's like a minimum.
Yeah, that's the minimum. But ideally, at least 24 hours, 24 hours to, um, yeah, the sooner the better, but we know it takes time to prepare for a meeting, and things change, especially if you're getting new data coming in, or new information coming in. But in an ideal world, you would get the agenda, at least 24 hours before the meeting begins. So you have your time to prepare and be ready for it.
Yeah. I would say, like, in an ideal situation where everything is perfect in this world, it's like Candide's in the best of all possible worlds. An agenda, the amount of time before meeting the agenda sent out is directly related to the amount of time, the work, the preparation for that agenda will be. So if a person has to create a whole report to share at that meeting, and that report's going to take a week, then that agenda will have to be sent out a week in advance so that they know that they need to prepare that stuff. But most of the time, meetings are about things that are already in progress. So in that situation, 24 hours is good. But if you can do it 3 days in advance, that's great. If you can do it a week in advance, that's fine. Probably more than a week in advance is starting to get a little too far out because that sort of gets lost in people's regular
Mm.
flow of things. Now, one really good tip for meeting facilitation is if you have an agenda and you are able to get it out in advance, is to give people the opportunity to add things to the agenda. So if you add something to the, if you send an agenda 30 minutes in advance, people may not even see that before they get to their meeting. So if you send it out in 3 days in advance, then people have an opportunity to think, okay, what else needs to be in this meeting? And they can email you and say, hey, can you add X to the meeting? Or can you add this person to this meeting? And that way there's enough time to readjust the meeting to accomplish what everybody would like to accomplish. Let's see. Oh, another great question. What advice do you have for people who get nervous speaking up in meetings in front of others? Yes, public speaking. So this is a really important, vital, and fear-inducing question for a great many people. The nice thing is that at most meetings, you won't have to speak for a long time, number one. And number two, it's with people who you're relatively familiar with, people who you work with on a very regular basis. So the risk of, flubbing something or using a lot of filler words or all those things that people are afraid of when it comes to speaking, or the risk of, falling down the stairs or something when you're going up the podium are really, really low. The stakes in most meetings are really, really low when it comes to the technical aspects of public speaking. You don't have to be incredibly entertaining when you're just having a working meeting to create, the product specs for something. So
Yeah,
that's one thing. Go ahead, Steven.
um, Oleg is great at public speaking, and actually, I think you've done a presentation on public speaking
We've
as
done a
part of
few.
Work Ready program. Done a
Yeah.
few,
Yep.
but yeah, I would agree with Oleg. You just have to be, you have to give yourself some grace. Know that everyone gets nervous, and it takes practice, and it's okay not to say the right things. Again, it comes back to communication style. Like different people have different communication styles. You have a different communication style, and it takes time and practice to find your own voice, in a meeting as well too, especially if you're earlier on in your career. But yeah, there's tons of resources out there. I think Oleg, you mentioned Toastmasters, right?
Toastmasters.
Yeah, that's one
Mhm.
organization that helps you practice how to public speak. Give.
Two thumbs
Um,
up for Toastmasters.
yeah,
If I had more thumbs, I would put more thumbs up for Toastmasters. So, and one other thing or two other things to think about when it comes to public speaking at meetings is it's really just like public preparing for a speech if it wasn't at a meeting. If it was, if you're speaking, I don't know, at a funeral, if you're delivering a eulogy or any other kind of public speaking, at a wedding, um, the those two things are number one, preparation. Preparation is vital. So whether you're, delivering a best man speech at a wedding or presenting on latest sales numbers. You have to be prepared. You're rehearsing. The more nervous you get, the more you should be rehearsing. Sometimes that takes time. Even if it's just presenting the sales numbers, it's going to take you 2 minutes to present something like that, a few slides, 3 minutes, spend time doing that a few times before the meeting. It is by yourself or with somebody you trust. uh, it's really that's what it's all about. Even like Stephen mentioned, my public speaking. I rehearse all the time. Rehearsing is like I say the presentations so many times before I present them, because that's what makes me confident when I'm actually in the moment. Um, there was another thing that I was going to mention, but let's move on to the next question. What's the difference between a meeting and an interview?
well, interview is a type of meeting. It's a meeting with purpose. It's usually two or more people, and the purpose of that meeting is one, information sharing. The candidate is sharing about themselves and their qualifications. And then the interviewer is sharing, the requirements of the job, what they're looking for. And it's two parties sharing information. And that is a definition of a meeting. So I would say an interview is a type of a meeting. And, if you're the interviewee, if you're the candidate, your purpose is to get the job, right? But the purpose of the interviewer is to assess all the candidates and see who would be the best person for the job.
Mhm.
So, in a meeting, different people, like we mentioned, have different agendas or different purposes, and that's okay too. A meeting could have more than one purpose.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the distinction between an interview and most other types of meetings is that an interview is extremely structured. So most types of meetings, and this is answers another question that we have, is in most types of meetings, most people will have at some point be talking, and the conversation will be, easygoing, and it will be unstructured. People can jump in and share what they need to share. In an interview, it's very structured. People are going back and forth, and that's pretty much it. So it's that structure that distinguishes an interview from most other types of meetings. Let's see. In a meeting, who's the one that are supposed to who are the people that are supposed to be talking? That depends on the meeting. That depends on the purpose of the meeting. If it's an information sharing thing where people need to be aware, and it's like, I know, Stephen, you mentioned the idea of like a community meeting or like a CEO's report or something where or like in the Apple conferences where in the past, I guess Steve Jobs, or now that other guy or whoever is announcing a new product. That meeting, like that guy is talking, or like in the CEO is talking, and then people might be asking questions afterward, and then they're talking. But it depends on if it's a working meeting and everybody's trying to collaborating to provide their skills and experience and input on creating a document, for example. Then each person takes turns.
And I
That's
think,
important though. I'll go
yeah,
to take turns. I mean, the etiquette portion.
and I think the role of a good meeting facilitator, if you're doing your job well, you allow the space for people to talk. And if there is an awkward pause in the meeting, then you can sort of move it along to the next topic, or sort of call on somebody who you suspects might have something to say, but maybe they're nervous about it.
Mhm. We're getting to the end of our program here. We have one more question. So if you have that question at the tip of your tongue, at the edge of your brain, put it in your fingers and type it into our chat or the Q&A, because we're getting to the end here. And really, if you have questions, we want to help you out with them. So this last question here is, how much in advance should a meeting be scheduled? Unlike an agenda, a meeting can be scheduled as far out in advance as you schedule things. So in an environment where schedules are really free flowing, where things come up all the time, where schedules are always changing because emergencies or whatever come up, then probably you schedule a meeting less in advance because it's probably going to change. But if you want to, if your time tends to get booked up, and those bookings are pretty, they don't change very much, as far in advance as you feel a meeting is important. So if that meeting is really, really important to you, schedule it 6 months in advance. Just put it on your calendar as a slot on your calendar, and then just check in closer with the person who you're meeting with, saying, "Hey, we're still meeting." You check it in 3 months and say, "Are we still meeting in 3 months?" Cool. Yes, we are. And then check in like 2 weeks before. Are we still meeting at that time? Cool, we are. But then, when everything else starts to press in, you have that slot open already, and you're not going to be struggling to find a time to meet with this person or with this group. Do you have anything to add, Stephen? I kind of monopolized that question a little
No,
bit.
no, I agree. If if you have a meeting to plan, just get it on the calendar. And if you're working with folks that have a busy calendar, it really does help to get it scheduled, as soon as the meeting is needed. And the great thing about the technology now is that there are so many different tools and softwares and different types of calendaring tools out there that helps people keep track of their calendars, whether it's your Google Calendar or your Outlook calendar or whatever different software you have. There are tools out there that helps you schedule meetings, so you're not calling each person up, or sending out paper invitations like we used to do back in the day, or call
Mhm.
people individually.
And I don't think you did this on purpose, but this speaks exactly to what our next Work Ready program is next month. Our next Work Ready program is all about an overview of productivity software,
Oh, yeah.
including project management software. So we'll be doing a really quick tour with hits and features on commonly used software like Microsoft Office. We'll talk about Word, we'll talk about Excel, we'll talk about the presentation software, we'll talk about project management software, and there's a great many options out there. We'll cover a few and some features that are common among them. We'll talk about spreadsheet software. So if you are interested in what is kind of the standard in most offices these days, the kind of software, then this will be an interesting program for you, because then you'll get a sense of, well, I don't know this, I've never heard of this, I should maybe learn this. And then I'll tell you how to do that. So let me give you the information for that program. It's going to be on February 21st. That's a Tuesday at 11 o'clock. You can sign up for that now. You'll get a reminder 24 hours before the program. But like I said, if your calendars get full, scheduling in advance, scheduling a month ahead to attend an event like this is good. And even if you're not able to attend at the moment, we'll send you a recording. So you're all set. The registration link is in the chat. And as a final request, I'm going to post a link to our post-event survey in the chat right now. It's very short, but it helps us plan future events. One of the questions on that survey, which is going to take you a whole 2 minutes, probably less, is what you'd like us to cover in the future. And make sure if you have topics that you're interested in or you want to know about, put those in there, and we'll use that to plan for our future events. Stephen, thank you very much for your input on this meeting about meetings.
Thank you, Oleg.
And
I've learned a lot.
yeah, me too. This is a really interesting presentation. And thank you to all the people out there who stuck with us here, who asked your wonderful questions and joined us on this work ready journey. We will see you next time.